Okay, so this week we're actually going to be introducing a couple new components. So I'm going to first start by talking about those, then talking about the code that we'll use in order to use them. Okay, so the first one, this is object right here is called a servo motor. Okay, they're used in robotics. They're used in all sorts of like RC cars and stuff. And you'd find them actually in a lot of places just without realizing it. And so what it does is it's something that can take instructions and convert it to motion. And so it has kind of like 180 degrees of rotation here. Okay, and we can actually control the position using the Arduino. Okay, and so that's one of the things that we're working on this week. So the things that are important to know is this. You see 3 wires right here of different colors. Okay, you have a brown, a red, and a yellow. Okay, the red, it goes to like the high voltage, so like the 5 volt, the positive side. The black goes to the negative, the ground. Okay, and then the yellow is what connects to a pin on the Arduino and gives you a chance to control it. Okay, and so for now we're just going to use these wires to hook it to the breadboard. Later we can actually have a set of pins so we can just plug it straight into the breadboard. But what's important is you understand what each of these colors mean, okay? Because this is a situation where you want to be really careful not to wire this backwards, okay? Like to switch the black one and the red one, okay? And again, the color of these wires don't matter at the top here, but we're going to use them at least in this example so that we make sure we understand what their purpose is. Okay, so for now when you wire it, you're actually going to use these jumper wires and then put it straight into the breadboard. When you do wire to the breadboard, you're going to attach it next to a capacitor, okay? So this object right here is a capacitor, and the responsibility it has is to basically store charge, to level out the charge. What happens is, when you turn on a motor, and a servo is a kind of motor, it is going to start to draw a lot of current right when it turns on. And the Arduino is not actually capable of providing that current. And so what this device does is it prevents it from drawing too much current from the Arduino. Okay? If you look at it, it's got a long leg and a short leg. If you remember, the long leg means what? It means positive. Okay? In addition, just so you don't forget, these have actual negative signs printed on them. Okay? So that you remember which way goes to negative. The reason this is so important is that capacitors, if they're hooked up backwards, can be damaged, and some can actually explode. That won't be an issue in this case. This one's doesn't have enough capacitance, I'd say, to be able to explode, or it can't store enough energy to be able to explode. But what we would do here is make sure that the negative goes to the side where the black wire is coming from, or where the brown wire is, and the positive goes to where the red one is. Okay, don't want to make that mistake here. Okay, if you're careful with it, it shouldn't be a problem. Remember that this is the negative side here where you see the gray strip. It has the short leg there too. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to be using this week, well, you can control the servo with any of these pins on the Arduino. And we're also going to be using a potentiometer, which is a switch that you control by turning a knob. Okay, and when we use a potentiometer, instead of just checking to see if it's on or off, we actually want to see how far on or how far off it is. And so we plug it into this side where it says analog in. Okay, these pins right here are capable of not just reading whether something's on or off, but it's capable of reading like a range of values. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. This is a program that's been created to actually control a servo, and this is what we'll be finishing with in our next activity. So whenever we're using a servo, it actually requires some really complicated instructions. And what happens is there's sometimes when somebody works really hard to put together a set of code to control something, and they make it available for other people to use. And so in this case, we have an example of that. So whenever we want to use a servo, we use something called a library. And what we're doing is we're loading in a set of code specifically designed for when you're working with a servo. And whenever we use that, you use this line where it says pound include, and then you'll type the name of the library. If you wanted to click on this, you could actually see what was in that library and what the servo did. And so oftentimes you'll use libraries with Arduino code so that you can expand your capabilities. So like today, since we want to use a servo, we're going to use a servo library. And when we use a servo, we start by identifying what the servo is. Okay. In this program, we also are assigning something to the analog pin on the Arduino. Okay. And that was the analog pin that I just showed you in the video. So instead of just being numbered like the digital ones, they have the letter A and the actual number of the pin. So we begin by attaching the servo, and this is where you tell it to what line it's on. Okay, and we could even make a variable here. It says int servo pin equals 9, and then we could just replace this with servo pin. Okay, and then here we have another function called analog read, and what this does is it reads an analog value. Okay, so whereas a digital one gives you a number between that's either 0 or 1, this gives you a number between 0 and 1023. Okay, and it gives you somewhere along that range. And so if you're turning a dial, it could have an infinite number of positions, and this is going to take those positions and place them somewhere between 0 and 1023. So whenever we're using that though, sometimes it's useful to, so like here we're controlling a servo. Well, a servo goes from 0 degrees to 179 degrees. So we have to tell this program to take what the servo says, or what this pin reads between 0 and 1023, and basically control the servo with it by telling it to go to an angle between 0 and 180. Okay, and we might tweak these because sometimes they have a trouble getting up to all the way to the end. Okay, and so here's another function called the map function, and this allows us to map one set of values to another. Okay, and so we're trying to basically take this range and compare it to this range right here. So we're taking this number between 0 and 1023 and turning it into a number between 5 and 175. So we're taking the reading from the potentiometer, the rotating switch, and turning it into an angle for the servo. Okay, and then later we go down here and write the servo to that angle based on what the switch said. Okay, so we have a couple new things here. We're using a library which has its own set of commands to create the servo and to write to the servo and then to assign the servo to a pin. We have an analog input, so we're assigning something to an analog input and we're reading that input right there. Okay, so analog read, that's something new for us as well. And then finally we have this map function that allows us to take a set of values and map it to another set of values. So I'm going to walk you through all the steps in this program again, just so that we're totally clear what's going on. So here's where we bring in the Servo Library. Okay, and a library is a set of code that allows us to expand what we can do within this coding environment. So here we're going to use this code to help us control an Arduino, or sorry, a servo. Here's where we create the servo. We're assigning the servo to a pin. Okay. We are introducing a pin for the potentiometer, and then we're introducing these two variables to do basically some math with, so that we end up with putting out the values that we need. Okay, then here we're creating, setting up which servo is connected to which pin. We're setting up the serial monitor, and then inside the loop we assign the value of the potentiometer. We bring it in from analog read. Okay, so it's going to read us a number between 0 and 1023. We have a thing set up that will print out that value for us. and then we're going to take the value we got from the pin and use this function to turn it into an angle between, right now it's set to be between 5 and 175, or it could be between 0 and 180. And then we're going to print the angle. Okay. And then finally we're going to control the servo and tell it to go to that angle. So it's going to change its position, and then it's going to wait 15 milliseconds and repeat that process again. One thing you're going to notice differently this week that will be the case for future weeks is when you click to go to the activity, I'm going to take the activity and make a beginner, intermediate, and advanced version of it. In the beginner version, I'm just going to write the code exactly as it should be. Okay, and so like if you go here, make sure you're reading the instructions. They're going to tell you what to do. But in this case, you're just going to copy this code straight into CodeBender, and there's a couple places where you need to choose basically a number where you have something plugged into the Arduino. But from there it should run as is once you pick those numbers. And the reason we're doing this is so that when you're copying this code in, I want you to make sure you're reading through it, understanding what's going on. But this will take time and frustration away from the debugging process, which I think is starting to get in the way of us having opportunity to learn. Okay, and later I'm also giving complete set of code just to paste into that original program. And so this would be like the beginner version. Then we would have an intermediate version in which you have, I give you the lines here, but I don't set it up for you the way it should look. So it gives you a little bit more of a challenge, okay, if you want to push yourself a little bit more. And then finally we have the advanced version in which I'm not actually going to write in the code for you, and you'll be doing the same activities but trying to write it from scratch. Okay, and so when you pick these, I want you to make sure you're picking one that makes sense for you, but I also want you to make sure you're still using it as an opportunity to learn the code and learn how to work with the Arduino.